A lot is made of the great two-man tag teams in wrestling history, but what about those equally as fantastic three-man acts? Well, in many ways, it's the trios of the industry who have given us some of its best moments over the years. But who are the best of them all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And if we're going to be starting anywhere today, let's do so with perhaps the biggest example of a successful trio ever, at least in terms of box office, and that's the original incarnation of the NWO. Yes, the New World Order's ranks may have later swelled to unmanageable levels, but at least in those early days, it was the perfect size for it to feel like WCW was being attacked by an invading force in scenes of guerrilla warfare each and every week. But how did it all start? Well, that happened on the May 19th, 1996 episode of Nitro, as it was then that Scott Hall, a man who until only days recently had been under contract with WWF, walked out of the crowd and announced that he was there to start a hostile takeover. And as if that wasn't reason enough to get excited, a few weeks later he'd be joined by former WWF champion Kevin Nash too, as the pair from there began labeling themselves the Outsiders and creating chaos every time they unexpectedly hit the ring. Clearly then, the idea was that both men had been sent over by Vince McMahon to invade the competition and possibly even destroy them from within. But while this was already a 5-star angle in its own right, it would all go to another level again when, at Bash at the Beach on July 7th, eternal babyface Hulk Hogan turned on the fans and joined up with the Outsiders, an act which led to the official birth of the NWO. That's right, one of the most game-changing storylines of all time was now underway, and on each episode of Nitro after that, Hogan, Hall, and Nash would continually interrupt the proceedings, disrupting the show like a gang of thugs. So crazy did things get, in fact, that at one point, some fans even called the police when they felt one of the group's brawls looked a little too real for comfort. But alas, this initial excitement of the three-man crew raging against the world couldn't last forever, so that was why pretty soon, new members were being added in the forms of folks like the Giant, Ted DiBiase, and Syxx. And while this didn't exactly hurt things yet, it was a sign of what was to come, as eventually the New World Order would include dozens more, way too many for anyone to keep up with. Still, none of that will ever take away from the fact that for a few months there, when it was just the three ex-WWF guys bending WCW to their will, it was about as perfect of an angle as could be. That said, you could argue even then that there was a better trio to exist years before them, and that's the Fabulous Freebirds. Hell, not many teams have a rule named after them, but the Freebirds do, a sign of just how influential they are. And it's not just the Freebird rule of defending tag team titles that the trio of Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy, and Buddy Roberts originated. No, they were also arguably the first team to ever use entrance music as part of their act. Yes, Bad Street USA still stands today as a groundbreaking moment in the industry's history. But of course, that's all the sizzle surrounding the steak. And the steak was very rich in their case too. Why was that? Well, with Hayes there to act as the loudmouth talker of the trio, it left Gordy and Roberts able to play the ass-kickers who could beat up absolutely anyone in their path. Seriously, it didn't matter if they were in Memphis, Georgia, or most famously, Dallas, where they worked for Fritz von Erich, the Fabulous Freebirds were a force to be reckoned with. And this led to them having a total of 9 tag team title runs over the course of their career. But even that wasn't their high watermark, because it was while in Dallas that they started an all-time legendary feud with the Von Erich children, and there had a series of high-drawing 6-man tag matches against them, which saw them pass the territory's trios belts back and forth a total of 5 times. So really then, with all these achievements to their name, it's hard to argue against the Freebirds being the greatest trio of all time. But argue we will anyway, because our next subject no doubt feels like they're even better. Who are we talking about here? Why, The Shield, of course. Now, if you weren't watching in 2012, it's hard to overestimate the excitement which came about when, at the end of a triple threat world title bout between CM Punk, John Cena, and Ryback at November 18th Survivor Series, a trio of figures who were up until then unknown to main roster fans appeared and laid waste to everyone in their path. Really, it was like a direct shot of adrenaline into the arm of a show which was fast falling in quality again following the botched events of the Summer of Punk. And luckily for fans, it wasn't just limited to that one night. No, as the weeks went on and the threesome revealed themselves to be Roman Reigns, Dean Ambrose, and Seth Rollins, they continued to deliver their own brand of renegade justice wherever they went. That said, this alone is not enough to make them one of the greatest trios ever. No, what put the Shield a step above most was that with each having a distinct role to play in the proceedings, it felt like they were made for each other. After all, Ambrose was the lunatic fringe, the resident wild man liable to go off the handle at any given moment, while Rollins was the architect of the entire operation, the one calling the plays and keeping things moving. And when it came to Reigns, well, he was the silent heavy, the guy who didn't say much, but let his fists do the talking for him instead. Of course, when you put them all together then, you had a well-oiled machine that simply couldn't be beaten by anyone for their first few months on the roster. Seriously, it didn't matter who was thrown at them. John Cena, Randy Orton, Kane, Daniel Bryan, everyone fell to the heel faction, as when they were together, there was simply no weakness to be found in their armor. And because of this dominance, something unusual happened for the time period in New York. Over the course of an 18-month period, the company were able to take 3 relative unknowns and turn them into legitimate superstars. And because of what they did here, Reigns, Ambrose, and Rollins are arguably the 3 biggest stars in the industry today. But what about a trio who served as a chief rival to the Shield during their early 2010s run? A group who were far less about tactical warfare and more about psychological attacks. How did they measure up to the greats? Well, pretty well actually, and that's why our next subject is going to be the Wyatt family. Now again, we know the Wyatts eventually extended themselves to include a 4th member in the form of Braun Strowman, but in their original incarnation they were very much a 3-man act, one which was made up of Luke Harper, Eric Rowan, and of course the leader of the clan, Bray Wyatt. And what a group they were, because after debuting in the summer of 2013 and instantly capturing the attention of audiences everywhere with their creepy throwback gimmick, it became clear WWE had something special on their hands. But what was it that made them so special though, aside from the gimmick of course? Well, like with the Shield, when they worked together as a unit, they were nigh on unstoppable. Sure, the dynamic was different here, as their idea of working together was often for Bray to stand on the sidelines and send his lackeys to do his work, but the results were the same regardless. And yes, we know after a while the Wyatt family started to sink in a sea of bad booking, but that was no fault of their own. No, whenever they came out to the ring to do their job, they were as effective as ever, with Harper and Rowan being the muscles seemingly programmed to fight to the death, and Wyatt himself the tactician who was always on the lookout for new ways to manipulate people. So really, if for no other reason than they managed to withstand this and still be great, they deserve a spot on this video. But they weren't the first spooky trio to ever show up in New York. No, years prior, during the turn of the millennium, another group first introduced themselves as being people with an all-time great theme song and a taste for blood. Who are we talking about this time? Why, the Brood, of course. That's right, in the late 90s, vampires were a huge part of pop culture, something which could be seen in the likes of TV shows such as Buffy and films like Blade, and WWF's answer to this trend was equally as iconic in their own way, as they'd create a trio of wrestling vampires who liked to come to the ring through a sea of flames, then make short work of their opponents with a series of calculated assaults. Originally though, there was only one, with that one being Gangrel, a character played by David Heath, which was based on the tabletop role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade. But pretty soon he realized that if he wanted to survive the shark-infested waters of the Attitude Era, he'd have to recruit some help, and that was why he brought in 2 young up-and-comers to join his ranks in the form of Edge and Christian. Now, we shouldn't need to tell you who Edge and Christian are. After all, between them, they've since gone on to win a total of 15 world titles. Back in those early days, however, they were pretty far from their rated R superstar and instant classic incarnations. No, they were just 2 young guys who, let's say, enjoyed the alternative lifestyle which came with being a creature of the night. Sure, this may sound ridiculous, but there were a lot of ridiculous gimmicks in the Attitude Era. After all, it was the same period where we had wrestling pimps and porn stars. The important thing here was that whenever they hit the ring, the Brood quickly got over with live crowds in a big way, so much so that in February of 1998, they'd be involved in a main event program with the Ministry of Darkness. That said, after this, it became clear Edge and Christian were fast outgrowing their mentor, especially once their classic series with the Hardy Boys began later in the year. And so, because of such a fact, it meant the Brood would effectively be over come the summer, all except for the brief new Brood run of course, but the less said about that one, the better. No, it's better to move on to our next subject, a trio who also made their name during the turn of the Millennium Era. In their case though, it wasn't through drinking red viscous liquid or wearing long leather jackets. No, it was through dancing as only 2 cool could. Yes, despite starting off as a duo made up of Grandmaster Sexay and Scotty 2 Hotty in late 1999, it wasn't until Rikishi entered the mix a few months later that things really went to the next level for this group. Why was that? Well, while the sight of two goofballs dancing every week certainly had its charms, once they began incorporating a 400-pound Samoan into the routines, it became impossible to take your eyes off of them. Sure, they were more than just their dances, as they also kicked ass in the ring on a regular basis, so much so that over the course of their run, Scotty and Grandmaster became one-time tag team champions. Scotty became a one-time light heavyweight champion himself, and Rikishi became a one-time intercontinental champion too. And as if that wasn't enough, by early 2000s, they'd have built up enough of a rep for their in-ring work that they'd even be getting to mix it up with main event acts like D-Generation X and the Radicals. But really, more so than any of their battles, it's the lighthearted times Too Cool are most fondly remembered for today, such as when during the 2000 Royal Rumble they briefly stopped the whole bout to have a dance break in one of the most memorable spots in that match's history. And if this wasn't to your particular tastes, there was also the numerous times Rikishi delivered a stink face to some poor unsuspecting victim, all while his partners laughed along on the sidelines. Sadly though, the faction was not meant to last for long, because in the autumn of 2000, WWF made the baffling decision to turn Rikishi heel by revealing him as the man who'd run over Steve Austin the year before. And because the big man was now a heel following this, even if no one wanted him to be, it meant Too Cool would be no more either. Yes, gone were the good times and dancing, and now it was all about the push to get the former Intercontinental Champion up to that main event level. What the company didn't seem to realize at the time, however, was that had they just left him the way he was, with Scotty 2 Hotty and Grandmaster Sexay by his side, he'd have almost certainly got there anyway, and it would have been a hell of a lot more fun to watch him do it. But this is just the way things go for factions in the halls of New York. Eventually, everyone splits up, well, except for one notable example, that is, because even now, almost a decade in, the New Day are still going strong. Rewinding back to 2014 when the group were first introduced, however, few would have thought such a thing possible, as with them being written in such a cheesy way, it didn't take long for fans to turn on the act in droves. Luckily though, the team made up of Kofi Kingston, Big E, and Xavier Woods had a plan to deal with this, and that plan was to turn heel. That's right, if people were gonna boo them anyway, then why not play up to this and be the most arrogant villains they could be? Of course, as always happens with any great heel, eventually this led to audiences starting to actually like what they were doing, so much so that when they turned babyface once more soon thereafter, they'd be babyfaces for life. But then how couldn't they be, when their whole gimmick was basically just three geeky guys who liked to mess around and quote their favorite video games at each other? Not that this meant they couldn't fight too, of course. No, quite the opposite in fact, because since their debut, they've gone on to hold the tag team gold 12 times using the Freebird rule. And as if that wasn't enough, they've also supported each other whenever one decided they wanted to try their hand at singles action for a while. Hell, it was this very support which helped both Kofi and Big E to become WWE Champion in 2019 and 2021, respectively. So really then, the story of the New Day is one about the power of friendship above all else. As while pretty much every other act in wrestling turns on each other eventually, they've continued to remain a strong unit both on and off screen. But they're not the only trio of the modern day who were able to dominate the brand they were on through a tight familial bond. And that's because while they were doing this on Raw and SmackDown, over on NXT, the Undisputed Era were busy making Wednesday nights their own. Now again, we're not talking about the foursome the UC would become eventually when Roderick Strong joined them in 2018. No, we're talking about that original three-man unit of Adam Cole, Kyle O'Reilly, and Bobby Fish. And what made this group so effective once they began dominating NXT in 2017 was the fact that none of them were strangers to each other. Yes, they all had a long and storied history together during their time working for places such as Ring of Honor and Pro Wrestling Guerrilla. In fact, as Future Shock, Cole and O'Reilly had been a much-feared duo for a while in the latter, all up until the point they split and began a long-standing rivalry over the ROH World title. But at least O'Reilly had help during these subsequent wars, because by then, he'd already found a new friend in Bobby Fish, the man he'd go on to form Red Dragon with. And Red Dragon proved to be such a formidable force in their own right that they'd become three-time ROH Tag Team Champions. So obviously when all three men reunited in NXT, now with a unified mission once more, it meant doom for the rest of the roster, as week in and week out, they'd show their dominance, with this all leading up to the faction taking that dominance a step further when in November of the same year, they made the WWE version of War Games their own signature bout. And of course this would also be the night Roddy joined the faction too, meaning it would no longer be a threesome going forward. But while in many ways that only made them stronger, like with the NWO before them, there will always be a certain sense of nostalgia to that original trio of scoundrels who, with a hive mind unlike anyone else on the brand at the time, were able to do things no one else could. But not every great trio is about treating each member as an equal at the time. No, on occasion it's about one bigger star trying to give the rub to two younger up-and-comers. And there's few times this has been more evident than in the case of the Legacy. Really though, come 2008, Randy Orton was all too aware of the benefits of being part of a faction, as it was his inclusion in Evolution a few years prior, which had helped to propel him towards the main event scene. So obviously looking to give back after a certain point then, toward the end of the decade, he decided the best way forward was to start a faction of his own, one which would feature him at its helm. Who would he choose to surround himself with in this new group? Well, given the theme was to be second and third generation performers, it was a no-brainer that one of those would be the son of the American Dream himself, Cody Rhodes. And as Cody was already teaming up at that point with the $1 Million Man's offspring Ted DiBiase Jr., his inclusion soon became a lock too. That said, there was at one point briefly a fourth and fifth member of the Legacy, with those being Manu and Sim Snuka, the children of Afa and Jimmy Superfly Snuka respectively. But their inclusion proved to be so short-lived they ended up as nothing more than a footnote in the long run. No, the only thing people really remember about the faction today is that it helped propel at least one new star to the next level, as through their wars with the likes of the McMahon family during the highly underrated Age of Orton storyline, Cody was able to get a taste of what it felt like to be in the ring with performers such as Triple H. Eventually though, as was always going to happen, time was called on the Legacy when the group imploded in on themselves. But at least they got to go out in the best possible manner here, with a triple threat match against each other at WrestleMania 26. Yes, not every great trio gets to have such a strong finale, though that doesn't make the time they had together any less memorable. And when it comes to our next subject today, Team Angle, they certainly used every trick in their arsenal to stand out whenever they were on screen. What were those tricks they used? Well, the ability to out-wrestle everyone else around them, for one. And the reason they could do this was because while the group's namesake Kurt Angle was a legitimate Olympic gold medalist in amateur wrestling, Shelton Benjamin and Charlie Haas were no slouches in that area either. Hell, that was exactly why the former WWE champion recruited them specifically when he needed some help to get him through his ongoing series of wars with Brock Lesnar. And it's just as well he did this, because when the power of all three was linked up together after that, even the Beast himself struggled to make any headway. But it wasn't all just about helping their leader get victories. No, Team Angle also had a mission to conquer the tag team division as well. And that was exactly why, while Kurt was often either defending or challenging for the WWE title over in the main event of SmackDown, Haas and Benjamin were plying their craft earlier on the show as a two-man unit. How did this work out for them? Exceptionally well, as it happened. After all, they weren't called the world's greatest tag team for nothing. No, between 2002 and 2004, in fact, they'd win the tag team titles on two separate occasions, once from Los Guerreros, and then again from Eddie Guerrero and Tajiri. Hell, even after Haas and Benjamin eventually went their own separate ways from Kurt after having a very public disagreement with him about their abilities, they continued to pair off together for a while yet. But at this point, it would no longer be as a trio. And again, while it was still nice to see them work together, it was never quite as nice as it had been when all three members were on the same page. Of course, the same could be said about many of the teams we've discussed today, because as we've seen, 3 really is the magic number.